There's a version of intelligence that most people find easy to imagine. The kid who gets straight A's, the person who's good at everything, the one who always has the answer, always figures it out first, always seems to be running a few steps ahead of everyone else in the room. That's the version that gets celebrated. That's the one that shows up in movies and gets called a gift. But there's another version, a quieter one. And it looks almost nothing like that. It looks like someone who can't stop thinking about a single idea for 3 days straight. Someone who feels vaguely out of place in almost every social situation they've ever been in. Not because they're unfriendly, but because something about the frequency just doesn't match. Someone who finds most conversations just slightly too shallow to fully settle into. Someone who is deeply, privately exhausted in a way they can't always explain. Super high IQ isn't just the ability to solve problems faster. It's a fundamentally different way of experiencing the world. And for a lot of people who live inside it, it comes with a set of psychological realities that almost nobody talks about. Because from the outside, it looks like everything should be fine. You have the intelligence. What else could you possibly need? But the research tells a very different story. And once you understand what it actually means to process the world at that level, not just cognitively, but emotionally, socially, existentially, the picture becomes something much more complicated than the version we celebrate. This video is about that picture. Let's start with the thing that surprises people the most when they first hear it. Extremely high IQ is one of the most reliable predictors of loneliness. Not social anxiety necessarily, not shyness, not a lack of warmth or desire for connection, just loneliness. A persistent, low-level sense of not quite being met by the world. And the reason is more specific than most people realize. When you operate at a significantly higher cognitive level than the people around you, something happens in conversation that's very hard to explain from the outside. The topics that genuinely captivate you, the ones you can spend hours thinking about, the ones that feel alive and urgent and worth diving into, don't land the same way for most people. And the topics that seem to dominate most social interactions, the small talk, the familiar rhythms, the conversations that circle the same surface-level territory, don't hold you the same way. Neither group is doing anything wrong. It's a frequency mismatch, but the experience of it, day after day, interaction after interaction, produces something that feels very much like isolation. Not the kind where you're physically alone, the kind where you're surrounded by people and still somehow unreachable. Psychologist Lita Hollingworth, who conducted some of the earliest research on exceptionally gifted individuals, found that children with IQs above 180 often experienced what she called a profound sense of aloneness, not because they disliked other people, but because the gap between their inner world and the available social world was simply too wide to consistently bridge. And here's the thing about that loneliness, it tends to produce a very specific coping response. The person learns to code switch, to perform a version of themselves that fits the room, to hold back the part of their mind that's running at full speed and offer instead the part that translates well, the lighter version, the easier version, the one that doesn't ask too much of the conversation. It works. Socially, it works well, but it has a cost. Every time you perform the edited version of yourself, some part of you registers the gap between who you showed up as and who you actually are. And over time, that gap becomes something you carry everywhere. Here's something that surprises people about extremely intelligent minds. They are not, as a rule, calmer than average minds. They are not more at peace. They do not worry less. In many cases, they worry significantly more. This seems counterintuitive. Shouldn't greater intelligence mean a greater ability to reason through problems, to assess them accurately, recognize which ones are worth attention, and let go of the rest? In theory, yes. In practice, the opposite often happens. When your brain has a higher processing capacity, it doesn't use that capacity only when you ask it to. It runs constantly. It applies the same analytical power that makes you exceptional at solving problems to scenarios that aren't actually problems at all. Conversations from last week, decisions that are already made, outcomes that can't be changed, future events that may never happen. Psychologists call this overexcitability. and it was identified by Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski as one of the core characteristics of high potential individuals. The brain isn't just more capable, it's more active. It produces more connections, more associations, more pathways between ideas, which is what makes it powerful. But it also means it doesn't quiet down the same way. The highly intelligent person lies awake, not because something is wrong, but because their mind found 17 angles on a problem that doesn't even need solving right now. And there's a particular flavor of overthinking that's especially common in very high IQ individuals. It's a pattern of thinking called catastrophizing upward, meaning the mind doesn't just imagine worst case scenarios, it models them fully with multiple contingencies, cascading consequences, and detailed alternative paths. Because the same capacity that lets you think 10 steps ahead in a professional context doesn't know how to stop at 2 steps when you're lying in bed trying to sleep. You can see every possible way something could go wrong, and you can see it in extraordinary detail. The people around you see 1 or 2 things to worry about. You see 47. And the exhausting part is, you're often right about them. Before we go further, if this is giving a meaning to something you felt but couldn't quite name, that's exactly what this channel is here for. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we break down the psychology behind the experiences that most people feel but nobody explains. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely matters. Now let's keep going. There's a particular kind of suffering that doesn't get taken seriously because it doesn't sound like suffering. Chronic boredom, not the boredom you feel when you're waiting for something, not the temporary restlessness of a slow afternoon, but a deep, persistent structural boredom. A sense that most of what the world is offering just doesn't reach the level of stimulation that your mind genuinely requires to feel alive. For super high IQ individuals, this is one of the most pervasive and least discussed challenges of their psychology. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's research on flow states found that the experience of deep engagement, the state where skill and challenge are perfectly matched, requires a challenge level proportional to your ability. Too easy, and you don't enter flow. You coast. And coasting, for a mind that needs to be fully engaged to feel present, doesn't feel like rest. It feels like erosion. Most environments are not designed with extremely high cognitive capacity in mind. Most jobs, most school systems, most social structures, they're designed for the median. And when you're operating significantly above that median, almost every environment you move through feels calibrated slightly or drastically below your level. The result is a specific psychological state that researchers call chronic understimulation. And it produces consequences that look, from the outside, like completely different problems. It produces procrastination, not from laziness, but from a brain that refuses to engage with tasks it has already fully processed before beginning. Why spend time on something your mind finished in the first 30 seconds? It produces impulsive behavior, not from poor self-control, but from a search for stimulation intense enough to actually feel like something. It produces a restlessness in relationships, a tendency to disengage from connections that have stopped offering novelty, depth, or growth. And perhaps most painfully, it produces self-judgment, because from the outside and even from the inside, chronic boredom looks like ingratitude, like a failure to appreciate what you have, like a character flaw rather than a cognitive reality. But it's not a flaw, it's a mismatch. And understanding that distinction changes everything. Let's talk about something that rarely gets said out loud. Extreme intelligence often makes sustained social connections significantly harder, not easier. There are several layers to this, and they operate at the same time. The first is the vocabulary problem. Not in the literal sense. Highly intelligent people are usually perfectly capable of communicating simply. But language is built on shared frameworks. When your mental models of the world are substantially more complex than most people's, finding words that accurately convey what you mean without either losing the meaning or losing the audience becomes a constant negotiation. You're always translating. And translation, done constantly, is exhausting. The second is the pace problem. Highly intelligent people process information and reach conclusions significantly faster than average. In conversations, this means they often know where the discussion is going before it gets there, and they spend a portion of every conversation managing the impatience of already being at the destination while everyone else is still on the road. This isn't arrogance, it's architecture, but it produces behavior that reads as arrogance. Finishing sentences, redirecting conversations, losing interest abruptly, that creates friction in relationships without the person fully understanding why. The third is what psychologists call the curse of knowledge. Once you understand something at a deep level, it becomes genuinely difficult to remember what it was like not to understand it. This makes empathy, specifically the kind of empathy that requires inhabiting another person's cognitive limitations, harder to access. Not impossible, but harder. And then there's the fourth layer, the deepest one. High IQ individuals often develop a very early, very acute awareness of human irrationality. They see the inconsistencies in how people reason. They notice the motivated thinking, the self-deception, the gaps between what people say and what they actually do. And rather than producing contempt, though it sometimes does, this awareness more often produces a quiet despair. A sense of watching something from the outside that you can't quite join because you can see the machinery of human behavior so clearly. And seeing it that clearly makes it very hard to simply be inside it without commentary. Here's a pattern that shows up in almost every study of very high IQ individuals: perfectionism, but not the kind most people imagine. Most people think of perfectionism as excessive attention to detail, as spending too long on tasks, as being overly fussy, as caring more than necessary about getting things exactly right. That's part of it. But the deeper and more psychologically significant form of perfectionism in highly intelligent individuals isn't really about the work. It's about the gap. Here's what that means. When your intellectual processing capacity is very high, your ability to envision ideal outcomes, the perfect version of a piece of work, a conversation, a life decision, a relationship, is also very high. You can see clearly what excellent looks like. You have an extraordinarily detailed internal model of what something could be at its best. And your ability to produce that ideal outcome is always, always slightly behind your ability to imagine it. This gap between what you can envision and what you can execute is the engine of perfectionism in high IQ individuals. Not because they have unrealistic standards, because their standards are generated by a mind that models the future in extraordinary detail and then hands the present moment the impossible task of matching it. The result is a particular kind of paralysis, the blank page problem. The project that never gets started because the version in your head is so complete, so fully formed, that beginning it in the physical world means accepting the inevitable reduction from ideal to actual. And alongside the paralysis comes shame, a private, persistent sense of underachievement that doesn't respond to external validation because the measurement isn't happening externally. It's happening against an internal standard that moves every time you get close to it. This is why many extremely high IQ people present to the world as high achievers while privately carrying a near constant sense of falling short. The achievements are real. The shortfall is also real. Both are true at the same time. Real quick, if this resonates deeply with you, share it with someone in your life who might be living this way quietly. Sometimes a video like this gives people a turn-back moment for something they've felt their whole lives but never had words for. There's an assumption embedded in how we talk about very high IQ that goes mostly unexamined. The assumption that high intelligence means emotional detachment. That reason and feeling exist on a spectrum, and that more of one means less of the other. That the very smart person is, by nature, the cooler one, more logical, less reactive, more insulated from the full weather of human feeling. The research says otherwise. In fact, extremely high IQ is frequently associated with heightened emotional sensitivity. Not in all cases. The relationship is complex and varies significantly by individual. But as a general pattern, the same overexcitability that drives intellectual intensity tends to drive emotional intensity as well. The highly intelligent person doesn't just think more deeply. they feel more deeply. The experience of beauty, grief, injustice, wonder, all of it tends to arrive with greater force and greater persistence than it does for the average person. This creates a very specific internal contradiction. On the outside, the high IQ individual often presents as composed, articulate, in control of their responses. They've learned, usually early, that their emotional reactions are too intense for most social contexts, that the degree to which something moves them isn't proportional to how much it moves the people around them. So they manage the presentation. They filter, but underneath that management is a person who is feeling everything at full volume. And the effort of managing the gap between the full volume internal experience and the filtered external presentation, day after day, year after year, is one of the least discussed forms of cognitive and emotional labor that comes with this profile. It also produces one of the most common and least recognized mental health patterns in very high IQ populations, a kind of existential fatigue. Not depression, necessarily. Not anxiety, though both are more prevalent in this group than in the general population, but a bone-deep tiredness that comes from always processing everything at maximum intensity while making it look effortless from the outside. The world sees the composed, capable surface. What it doesn't see is how much work it takes to maintain it. Here's the thing about extremely high intelligence that nobody in the celebration of it really prepares you for. It doesn't make life easier. It makes certain things easier. Specific categories of problem solving, pattern recognition, rapid learning. In those lanes, it's genuinely extraordinary. It opens doors that are closed to almost everyone else. But life in its entirety is not a problem solving exercise. And the traits that make a mind exceptional at processing complex information don't automatically translate into tools for navigating grief, or building lasting relationships, or finding peace with uncertainty, or sitting comfortably in the presence of things you can't fix, or explain, or fully understand. In fact, they sometimes get in the way. The same relentless analytical drive that produces insight at work produces overanalysis in relationships. The same pattern recognition that makes you effective at predicting outcomes makes it difficult to experience the present moment without simultaneously modeling its likely trajectory. The same capacity for depth that makes your inner world extraordinarily rich can make the ordinary world feel like it doesn't offer quite enough. And perhaps the deepest challenge, the one that sits underneath all the others, is meaning. Very high IQ individuals tend to reach existential questions earlier, more intensely, and with less tolerance for unsatisfying answers. The question of what any of this is for, what a life well lived actually means, whether any particular choice matters in any durable sense, arrives early and stays. And because the mind is capable of modeling so many possible answers and finding the weaknesses in all of them, the search for meaning tends to be perpetual rather than resolved. This isn't suffering, necessarily. Some of the most fully alive people on Earth carry this exact profile, but it is weight, the weight of seeing clearly, the weight of caring deeply, the weight of a mind that never really stops working, not because it's broken, but because it's built that way. And here's what I want to say about that weight. Not to soften it, but to reframe it. The same depth that makes some things harder makes other things more vivid. The same sensitivity that makes you ache in difficult moments is the thing that makes beauty actually land. The same relentless questioning that makes peace difficult is the thing that makes genuine understanding possible. The gift and the weight are not separate things. They are the same thing. If you find yourself living in what we explained here, not in a flattering way, but in a true way, I want you to hold that for a moment. Because the traits we talked about today are not character flaws. They're not things to be fixed or managed away. They're the inevitable texture of a particular kind of mind, a mind that experiences the world more intensely, processes it more deeply, and asks more of itself than most people are ever asked to ask. That's not easy. Some days it's genuinely hard, but it also means something. It means the world gets to have people in it who think at that level, who care at that depth, who won't accept a shallow answer when a real one is available, who push, sometimes against everything, toward understanding. The psychology of super high IQ isn't a story about advantage, it's a story about complexity. And the first step toward carrying it well is simply knowing what it actually is. If this lifted something in you, a word for something you've been living in, a mirror for something you felt, a sense of being seen in a way that doesn't usually happen, leave a comment. Tell me what that is. I read every single one. And if you want more of this, the real psychology behind the inner lives that most people never talk about, subscribe, because this is exactly what this channel is for. I will see you on the next one.